am Mary Margaret Whipple, Chairman of the Board of the Alliance for Housing Solutions, sponsoring today's event. We're so happy to see all of you here. Before I begin the introduction, let me mention that while Senator Kaine is speaking, people will be passing out index cards so that if you have questions, the time is limited, so we'll try to group the questions so that we can get the best use of that period of time. So I do remember when I first met Tim Kaine. I was on the Senate Local Government Committee, and this young, eager mayor of Richmond, Virginia, came and sat in the front row to testify to the Local Government Committee about some legislation that Richmond had. And he was very persuasive. And so that was my first experience. It wasn't too long after that he ran for Lieutenant Governor of Virginia, and when he did that, he presided over the Senate every day and attended our Democratic caucus there each day, so we had a lot of opportunity to interact. Then he was elected governor, and there were many, many accomplishments. Land conservation, no smoking in restaurants or bars, appointing the Climate Change Commission, working on spreading early childhood education to the children of Virginia. We know him now as our senator, where he serves on the Foreign Relations, Armed Services, and Budget Committees. And there was this little interlude of running for the Vice President of the United States. But that's not why he's here today. He's here today because in his legal career, he was a civil rights lawyer with a special interest in fair housing. Tim practiced law in Richmond for 17 years, specializing in fair housing law and representing clients who were discriminated against on the basis of race or disability. He was a board member of the Virginia chapter of Housing Opportunities Made Equal, HOME, that is the acronym, which he represented in a landmark redlining discrimination lawsuit against Nationwide Mutual Insurance Company, arising from the company's practices in Richmond. He actually won a $100 million verdict against the company, and while the judgment was, the amount of the judgment was overturned on appeal, they did settle for $17.5 million, which is pretty darn good. And he was a founding member of the Virginia Coalition to End Homelessness. And we're so fortunate to have him here today to share his thoughts on housing, on diversity and inclusiveness, and its value in building strong communities. Our senator and friend, Tim Kaine.
Thank you so much. And I want to thank my dear friend, Mary Margaret. It is a wonderful opportunity to come and be with her at any time because, as she said, we've spent some really fun, challenging times together, battled for good causes, and of course that Mary Margaret is no longer in the state legislature, but still battling for good causes. That is who she is. So Mary Margaret, thank you for inviting me to come. And to Christian and Michelle and Dave, you know, I go to too many events where I just talk and I don't listen. I'm really glad that I heard the presentation about Arlington's history. That was a really interesting one because I didn't know many of those facts. Christian, your assessment of this issue and the challenges, and that politics can get in the way of good solutions. We have to check our own preconceptions. That was important for me to hear. So I am looking forward to the chance to talk to you a little bit about my own experience as a fair housing lawyer, which began as a practitioner in 1984 to 2001. And then I've continued to work on fair housing issues in the public policy space, but I'll talk a little bit about some challenges that I think are the challenges of the day and tomorrow that were a little bit different than some of the challenges I first grappled with when I started. I also want to introduce one staffer I have because I want you to pester him with questions too after I leave. Gaston and Rose. Gaston runs my Northern Virginia regional office and has a lot of friends in this room too. Gaston, thank you for coming. The timing of this is great, and I very much want to thank the Alliance for doing it. It's the 50th anniversary of the passage of the Federal Fair Housing Act in April of 1968. You know, if you think about it, there is a lesson in that passage that is a lesson that should be one of optimism. 1968 was a horrible year. In fact, I find myself in 2018 thinking about being 60 years old and asking myself, has there been a year like this year? And 1968 is the year that comes to mind a lot as I'm seeing things that make me dissatisfied. 1968, the assassination of Martin Luther King in April, the assassination of Bobby Kennedy in June, Vietnam War protests, that really intensely disrupted both political conventions in that presidential year, and then profoundly shaped the presidential race, which profoundly then shaped much of what followed. 1968 was not a year that, if you think about it, you would think of good things happening, but it's a good lesson in life to know that even in a challenging, difficult time, some good things can happen. There could be green shoots coming up in a parched field. And the two in 1968 that are really powerful, which are sort of connected, are the April passage of the Federal Fair Housing Act, which was the last of the big blockbuster civil rights laws. There were the Voting Rights Act in 1965, the Civil Rights Acts in 1964, Title VII, accommodations, and the 1968 was sort of the last big civil rights act of the Great Society in April of 1968, and really driven by LBJ in honor and homage to Dr. King's legacy after he passed. The other thing that happened in 1968 is the Special Olympics started. First Special Olympics in Chicago in the summer of 1968. This tiny little movement that has now become an international movement, and of course that led to all kinds of new thinking about folks with disabilities. And because that's such an important issue now in housing, I think of Special Olympics and the Fair Housing Act as these green shoots in the midst of an otherwise challenging year. So if you feel like 2018 is challenging, there's some green shoots going on out there. Maybe we're seeing them and maybe we're not, but that's an important thing to think about. I was asked, as Mary Margaret said, and I want to talk a little bit about my personal background and then share some of the challenges we're grappling with now. I was asked to come and talk not because I'm in office, although that probably helped. I was asked because this is what I did for the 17 years of my active law practice. And I didn't do it by design, I did it by fortuitous accident. I don't really believe in accidents, things happen for a reason. But I am a Kansas City kid. I met a beautiful Virginian from Roanoke in law school. She's a better negotiator, so we moved to Richmond in August of 1984. And took the bar exam into July and found out in early October that I had passed, and I went to work with this tiny little law firm in Richmond that at the time I think I was the 12th lawyer. One day, a client came in with a sad story. You know what happens, and raise your hand if you are a lawyer or a recovering lawyer. Okay, I see some hands. And you're going to know what I mean. Somebody will come to a firm with a sad story and will say, who's the most junior person that we can direct this person to? And I had been maybe a week after passing the bar exam. And this young woman came to our office. Her first name was Lorraine. And she had a powerful story, but she couldn't pay the firm. But the firm had a heart, and they said, fine, go talk to Kaine. So she goes to the end of the hall. She's in my office. Now here's Lorraine's story. And I'm sitting across the table from her, and she's my age. I have just moved to a new city. She has just moved to Richmond, a new city. I had just finished my education. She had just finished her education. She had her first job after school, and so did I. I had just gone into this new city and found an apartment and moved into to get ready to be married a month later. And she was coming to see me because she had tried to find an apartment. She was looking at the one end. She saw an apartment available in a neighborhood that was convenient to where she worked. She called in the morning. I see this. Is it open? Sure. I'd love to come take a look at it. Fine. Why don't you come by? Are you free at lunch? I am. I'll come by lunch. 2 hours later, her lunch break, she goes to the apartment, and when she knocks on the door and interviews with the landlord says, I'm sorry, the place has been rented. Well, it had only been 2 hours, and it was on a Monday morning in the middle of the day, and she found it suspicious. So she went back and she asked the colleague at the desk next to her to call, and the colleague called, and hey, I see in the paper about this apartment. Is this still available? Oh yeah, please. Why don't you come by after work and look at it? And she was very aware that, okay, this happened because not until the landlord saw my face and saw that I was African American did he realize he didn't want to rent to me. This was a very simple, open and shut, straightforward case. It was my first lawsuit. I drafted it, filed it in federal court. We settled it. It became the beginning of a 17-year practice. That drafting, filing, and settling made me the Virginia expert on the Federal Fair Housing Act. At the time, the law was really bad in terms of remedies, so it was really hard to collect damages, really hard to get attorney fees, and so not many lawyers would do the cases. And that one case sort of started me on a path of expertise. But the reason I tell you about the story was it was very, very illuminating to me, a somewhat sheltered Irish Catholic kid from a very homogenous neighborhood in the suburbs of Kansas City. If I met an Italian Catholic, that was the worst. I mean, where I grew up. I had this experience of working in Honduras for a year, so I had seen a little bit of the world different than mine. But when I was talking to Lorraine, two things impressed themselves on my brain, and I can remember it as if she was sitting here today. The first one was how important housing is. Christian talked about it. It's part of, physical things aren't important, relationships are important, values are important, but a housing is not a physical thing. Housing is more of an extension of your personality than it is a physical thing. And so when you are denied, turned away, discriminated against in connection with your housing, there is a psychic punch to that is very, very difficult. And I can see that in Lorraine, and I'm sort of putting myself in her shoes, trying to have an empathetic reaction. I'm like, wow, my experience was I went out and I'm in a new city and I'm about to get married. It was kind of exciting finding a place to live, and I got this place to live. And it's this being out on my own as an adult for the first time in a big, wide world, and it was positive. And Lorraine went through the same experience, and it was negative. And because of that, the next time she looked for an apartment, she'd go into it with a question in her mind, am I going to get treated unfairly or not? So it wasn't even just the loss of this particular apartment, it was the planting of that seed of doubt about the way others would treat her that would have a continuing consequence in her life. And so the importance of housing really became manifest to me in my interaction with her, and when I saw how important it was to her, and also the debilitating nature of being discriminated against based on something that you cannot change. I had not at that point, nor have I ever, felt discriminated against on the basis of something I could not change. I've not had that experience, but when you see someone who has and you really listen to them, you understand having to carry that burden of doubt around with you. Even if you're being treated okay today, will somebody else treat you badly tomorrow because you have experience of that? That is a lot to carry around on somebody's shoulders, and it struck me. And so I was thrilled after that case to make this my expertise. And I represented people all over this Commonwealth against realtors, apartment communities, banks, homeowners insurance companies, local governments. I represented people who were chased out of neighborhoods violently when they sought housing. Tiny landlords with 5 units, massive landlords, some of the biggest companies in the country. The case that Mary Margaret mentioned is an example of how insidious discrimination can be. One of America's major insurance companies, in writing homeowners insurance, wouldn't write policies in minority neighborhoods. And testing revealed that if you called about, like a neighborhood where I live, to an insurance agent, you would get a quote. My house was built in 1920, but if you call from an African-American neighborhood, then you would be told, oh, well, we don't insure homes that are more than 50 years old. Well, you wouldn't know as you were being discriminated against that you were being discriminated against. You were just being told, okay, well, the company has a policy, they won't insure homes more than 50 years old. But of course the company did in all kinds of neighborhoods all over the United States, and it led to one of the largest civil rights jury verdicts at the time. It was the largest civil rights jury verdict in American history. The Virginia Supreme Court didn't like the size of the punitive damage component of the award, and so it ended up getting settled for less, but the size of the verdict demonstrated the outrage of a jury when they saw what this big company did. And I'll tell you something interesting about that case. We won a $100 million jury verdict. We lost it on appeal. We then settled it. The total settlement was $26 million, 17.5 for my client, and 8.5 for the National Fair Housing Alliance. Nationwide Insurance Company fired their CEO within a very few days after that jury verdict. They brought in a new CEO. He surveyed what they were doing, and he was like, this is nuts what we're doing. And he proceeded to systematically change what Nationwide was doing because he realized that all the reasons that they were turning people down were stupid and were costing them money. They were giving up good business from loyal customers in completely fine neighborhoods because of unfair stereotypes about the neighborhood. 10 years later, he retired as CEO, and my client, Housing Opportunities Made Equal, he invited, in Columbus, Ohio, he invited the CEO of Home to come out to his retirement banquet. And he brought her up on stage in front of the whole group, and he said, now here's somebody who taught us a very expensive lesson. But because of the lesson that Kaine and Home taught us, we not only now have been doing the right thing, we've been making a whole lot of money doing the right thing, because minority customers are every bit as good as a Caucasian customer, and we were assuming that wasn't the case. Well, I don't have a lot of stories like that where all's well that ends well, but it really was an example of step that the company had to be shaken out of their preconceptions and realized, of course, there's great business to be done. What are the issues that we're grappling with today? Well, when I started practicing in 1984, it was common that it would just be outright gross discrimination. I could go into a case and I'd get the records from the company, and they would write the race of applicants, and X through the ones who were not written to this person, and they'd write the race right on the application. These were blatant cases of racial discrimination, and often very blatant cases discriminating against people for other reasons too, national origin or disability. These blatant cases still exist, but good news is we're making some progress on some of the blatant stuff. But there are still an awful lot of challenges. We see continuing need to broaden what we think of as protected classes, that you can't be discriminated against because of these facts about you that you cannot change. And so, for example, I am a co-sponsor of two bills in the Senate. One's called the Equality Act, and one is called the Fair and Equal Housing Act, to make sure that people are not discriminated against based on sexual orientation or gender identity. The Equality Act would go into every civil rights act in the country and add those as protected classes. The Fair Housing Act specifically would go into just the Fair Housing Act to add that. And that's really important because there's a lot of discrimination that takes place still in housing and other areas. You can, thank God in this country now, you can marry whom you love, but if you can be turned away from housing, refused service at a commercial establishment, fired from a job because of your sexual orientation, we clearly have more to do. So broadening the definition of who is protected, that's the first thing that we have to be committed to. Second, as I talk to organizations like the Alliance or Home or others, National Fair Housing Alliance, VHDA is here, a great organization. The issues surrounding the housing needs of folks with disabilities, really, really important, because we think differently. I mean, and we should right now about disabilities. It turns out that the laws, like the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, that have raised opportunities for folks with disabilities, demonstrate that folks with disabilities have all kinds of capacity that we have often been blocking them from achieving because of not being sensitive to the situation and having laws that require equal treatment. One story, when I was Lieutenant Governor, I was the chair of the Virginia Disability Commission. By law at that time, the LG was chair of that commission. And because I'm interested in housing, I worked with VHDA. Here's what we were finding at the time. Very few apartments being built in Virginia were being built that were accessible to folks with disabilities. You know, wider doorways, lower counters, design accessibility. Very few were being built that way. I went to the VHDA and said, I got an idea for you. You are handing out very valuable tax credits for deals that are very favorable in terms of how deals get financed. And there's a lot of competition to get these tax credits. So why don't you give a developer extra points if they agree to make 15% of their units accessible? And they thought that's a really good idea. The developers didn't like it. They complained about it. But the VHDA, to their credit, did it. Didn't cost one penny. They just changed. If you apply, you're going to be treated better if you build a certain percentage of your units that are accessible. The developers didn't like it at the time, but within a year, they loved it. They were like, of course. Why did they love it? They loved it because in building, they suddenly realized, it's not just a person with a disability today that needs a wider doorway and a lower counter. As we age, all of us will. As we have friends come visit us or family come visit us, all of us find these to be really great design features. They also found that Virginians with disabilities are like super loyal. If they find an apartment that works for their situation, they are much more likely to stay and stay for a long time than just a normal average tenant, because there had been so few of these units. So a policy change that costs not one penny has, over the course of about 10 years, produced now thousands of units of housing that is accessible, and that has served a real need and been fine for the business community too. But I think the aging of our population, thank God we're living longer, that's great, but that means the medical needs and folks who at some point in their life will need those kind of accommodations, we will all need them, frankly. And so that's going to be a significant issue going forward. Another issue that is a very challenging, when Mary Margaret and I were sitting here talking about this stuff is not all easy, some of it is complicated, is affordability issues. I mean, I think the affordability one is the one that may be the toughest, and you know it better than anybody here. Housing costs in this region, housing costs in this community that has a great access to public transit and close to downtown. You see affordability in any community in this country, the percentage of your income that you need to devote to housing is going up and up and up. And that's going to require really novel partnerships between, and I saw we have folks from the Chamber of Commerce here, and financial institutions, and local government and state government. We're going to have to do our part. When the president submits a budget that just slashes all the housing funds, we have to run to find colleagues on the other side of the aisle to, hey, let's make sure that we put these monies back in the budget. And thus far, there are solid Republican colleagues in Congress on housing funding issues. We run into some ideological issues around like the affirmatively promoting fair housing, where sometimes it's more difficult to find bipartisan support, but at least on the dollar side, we have been able to keep money in the budget. There's no way to deal with affordability issues if you don't have the federal government as a partner on the funding side. So I think that one is really, really challenging. Tell you another issue that maybe is a little bit less about the feds and a little bit more about the state legislature. Virginia on the spectrum of pro-landlord or pro-tenant in our landlord-tenant laws, very pro-landlord. And how do you know? Well, just look at eviction stats. If you saw the article that Princeton researchers had done recently that was featured in the New York Times, I think 4 of the top 10 eviction cities in the United States are in Virginia. That's not because, you know, just 703 is a cursed area code or 804 is. It's because landlord-tenant laws are very heavily weighted toward the landlord in Virginia. And that doesn't mean you have to push it all the way to the other side, but finding a little more balance. We should not be proud of having eviction rates that are so far out of the national norm when we're 12th in the country in per capita income. We are not a bottom order state in per capita income anymore. We're a high per capita income state. That also involves high housing costs in some jurisdictions, but our laws are out of whack with what they ought to be now, and so that has to be changed. And then I'll mention one other one, and then conclude, and I'd love to take questions, and I think Mary Margaret said folks were submitting some, and I'm glad to answer them. The access to capital still is tough, access to credit. And we grappled with this recently in something in the Senate that a lot of my friends did not like the fact that I voted for, is banking reform bill. Here's 2 things that I hear as I travel around Virginia, then a statistic. Because I've traveled around for 5.5 years, I overwhelmingly hear, and still do for people, there's not enough places I can go to get a loan. For a house, for a business, for education, for ag. There's not enough places to access capital. And then I hear from a banking sector, the regulatory burden in the aftermath of Dodd-Frank, which had to happen. We had to do Dodd-Frank. For God's sake, the fiscal collapse, we had to do it. But the regulatory aspects of Dodd-Frank added a regulatory burden this size, and that's fine if your bank is this size, but if your bank is this size, adding that sort of a regulatory burden has had a huge effect on the banking industry. Here's a statistic that might surprise you. During the fiscal collapse in Virginia, we lost 1 bank, only 1. But since Dodd-Frank passed, we've lost 35% of our banks have disappeared. And they kind of disappeared the same way. I don't want to leave you with the impression that they just had to shutter because they couldn't do business. No, they're a bank of this size. The regulatory burden is this size. I'm like, it just doesn't make sense to hire that much regulation for a bank of our size. So we will sell out. and ironically will sell out to somebody bigger. And ironically, a law that was designed to stop too big to fail, in some ways has been accelerating too big to fail. And so community banks and regional banks are under intense pressure and often sell out, and we're rolling a banking industry up into larger and larger banks. Now, if we get to the point in this country where we have 5 banks that are meeting every last regulation we could throw on them, that will be horrible. You've got to have this mixture of credit unions, and regional banks, and local banks, and national banks. You have to have that mixture so that people have different places to go to try to get credit. And so I voted for a banking reform bill that I think that, look, had some complicated aspects to it, some things that were definite compromises, but were about trying to meet this issue of maintaining robust access to credit. And that's why I was supported by credit unions and regional banks and the National Banking Association, which is women and minority-owned banks. But these are tough issues, and trying to find that right balance of regulatory protection, but also maintaining this vibrant kind of multi-level banking sector, it's hard to get this stuff right. And that's why what you're doing today is so important. This is a dialogue that is not a dialogue of today. I mean, you will be talking about this in Arlington County. We will be talking about it in Virginia. We will be talking about it as a nation forever, because that, they're not, the population is growing and we're not adding land to the inventory. So we're going to have to be grappling with these issues. But you're as innovative as just about anybody in this state in trying to figure out novel solutions and partnerships to address. And I'm very, very happy to come and just encourage you to do more. And that's where I'll end. I'm a fan of vanity license plates. You follow somebody with a license plate and they've written something on the license plate, and you're supposed to decipher what it means. So, and I will follow, way past my turnoff, as I'm trying to figure it out. And one day, I was down in the Northern Neck and I was driving, and the guy passed me with the Virginia plate, and so put this in your mind. This was the plate, and this is my closing message to all of you. So the plate was G04TH ampersand. So you know what an ampersand is? G04TH ampersand X. I had a really hard time with that one. G04TH ampersand X. And I was just following, trying to figure out what this meant. Anybody have a guess? G04TH ampersand X. Go forth and multiply. So I thought, when I finally figured it out, I thought it's either, a reproductive physician, sex therapist, math teacher, minister. It's got to be one of the above. But that's my message to you. These are big, tough challenges. And those of you who are committed, we just need you to go forth and multiply, and that's how we will tackle this. Thank you for having me today, and I'm glad to have some.
Eloquently about fighting discrimination in housing on the basis of race and sexual orientation. What can be done to curtail exclusionary zoning laws that discriminate based on income?
Very, very, so let me talk about a couple of different kinds of exclusionary laws that discriminate based on income. One would be lot size requirements. So, as you're dealing with housing, if a jurisdiction has too big of a lot size requirement, now Arlington, you're talking more about a built environment, so I'm talking a little bit about something that more suburban counties grapple with. But lot size requirements are exclusionary zoning. They really make it tough to do affordable housing. And so that one would be very hard to challenge a lot size requirement in court. Now, the Supreme Court decided, they resolved an open question that had been open for decades. Can you win a fair housing case just based on a discriminatory effect, or do you have to show intent? You can win it based on effect. So if a lot size requirement has the effect of discriminating against people based on a protected class, you could win a lawsuit that way. But right now, income is not a protected class under the Federal Fair Housing Act. So yeah, it would drive up costs. You'd have to show that it actually had an effect on people based on race or disability using statistical models to do it. But you should battle, we need to battle against those at the local battle box. That's important. I'll tell you another one that's really prevalent is landlords that won't take Section 8 vouchers. So a low-income family that has a Section 8 voucher that will pay the landlord, a lot of landlords are, I'm not going to take that voucher. Even though that voucher is good money, even though somebody who has that voucher, look, that voucher is going to keep coming for a while. Somebody who's there based on their job, they could lose their job next month. I mean, in some ways, a Medicaid voucher is a much more reliable guarantee that you're going to get the rent paid than somebody's job, which could be up in the air the week after they're in the apartment. We have a lot of people who will not take vouchers a lot in the community. And there are things that local governments and state governments can do possibly to provide incentives for them to do that. So those are a couple of areas where income ends up, there is a de facto discrimination based on income, and you have to have novel strategies to combat it.
Do you think past housing policies are part of the reason for huge wealth disparities between Caucasians and African Americans?
Yes, and I've just been told I never had to stand at that mic anyway because I have a mic on. So I probably sound like David Bowie in Heroes where they had this double mic thing going on. You do need to know my obsession with rock and roll music. There is some fantastic research right now. You might think that the disparities in housing between white communities and minority communities have been driven by disparities in wealth. There's actually really powerful research that shows that it goes the other way. It's disparities in wealth are being driven by disparities in housing. So the causal relationship actually runs the other way. So the Color of Law book that talks about segregation, when a house is, for most Americans, the single largest asset that they have in their life is equity in a house. And when you have laws that restricted minorities for generations to, fewer neighborhoods or substandard neighborhoods where the housing would not appreciate, then basically it's disparities in housing that have locked in wealth disparities. And the research on that is extremely powerful. I mean, one way to think about it, and I think you do have to kind of have a long view if you're thinking about things like wealth disparities, we will commemorate 400 years of African Americans being in the English-speaking U.S. colonies next year. The arrival of the first slaves captured off a Portuguese slave ship brought ashore in Fort Monroe, Point Comfort at the time, and then Jamestown, 1619 to 2019. So the way to look at African American history over 400 years is roughly 8 half centuries. 8 half centuries. For 5 of the 8 half centuries, African Americans were enslaved. For 5 of the 8 half centuries. And even freed African Americans during those 5/8 of our history were ruled by the Dred Scott decision to be not even citizens. So even if you weren't enslaved, you could not be considered a citizen. So that's 5/8 of our history. Then 2/8 of our history is no slavery, but legally acceptable second-class treatment in voting, in housing, in jury service, in employment. You could be discriminated against and were by law or by private and individuals for 2/8 of our history. You just couldn't be enslaved. It's only been 1/8 of our history, only 1/8, that African Americans have been legally free of the second-class treatment. Still plenty of second-class treatment just because we're imperfect human beings and there's prejudices. But if you look at wealth disparities with that history in mind, it is only 1/8 of the history of African Americans in this country where there has been the absence of legally mandated discrimination, even though private discrimination still exists. So these wealth disparities, built in, impacted for generations, largely around that biggest asset that anybody owns, their home, are very, very persistent. And it's not the work of just one law or 1 or 2 generations to undo it.
Will Ben Carson's proposed Section 8 increases become law?
There's a chance, but the issue is funding. The issue is funding. I worry, and I think we all should, the tax bill that was done that increases the national debt by $1.5 trillion over 10. And it also has some significant changes in housing policy, or things that will affect housing, like deductibility of state and local tax payments will start to affect the market to some degree. But the increase in the national debt driven by the tax law is going to have, I think, a fairly predictable consequence of people coming back saying, oh, well, now the deficit's high, we're going to have to make cuts. So the Section 8 program can be made better, but it's a good, solid program because it gives people some choices. It doesn't confine them just to impacted poor neighborhoods, but allows them, if it's done right, if we can get more landlords to accept Section 8 vouchers, it gives people more choices. Good program. And if we could increase that voucher program, it would be powerful.
Do you believe that the housing industry is a weakness in the bid for Amazon headquarters, and how do you lobby against that?
Well, that's so I'm speculating because I'm going to intuit what Amazon might be thinking, but I'm not revealing anything about what they're thinking because I haven't had this conversation. I think the housing costs are a challenge, and I think transportation infrastructure is a challenge. Those would be the two challenges that Northern Virginia or the DC market generally would have in Amazon. Now, everybody they're looking at is going to have some challenges. I think the strength of this region is talent and brain power, educational institutions, high-quality people, and robust immigration. I mean, immigration is part of this talent pool of this region, and that's going to be a positive. But I will say, housing costs and transportation infrastructure, those are going to be the things that I think would be on the negative side.
So, one last question. What happened to Lorraine? Did she get her apartment?
Thank you. Of course I should have told you that. Well, it was the easiest lawsuit to win, that I had ever won, because even by the time she came to me, she was already in the midst of finding another apartment from a landlord who would treat her right. We were able to win this lawsuit in a way that paid for a whole bunch of months' rent for her. But here was a challenge. It was interesting. Because that case settled, but I ended up with many cases that didn't, that I had to try. And I often had to, how do you convince, bluntly, a white jury? She was discriminated against. Well, wait, but by the time we're in court, she found another place to live. How could you could convince a jury to say, yeah, no, they're liable, that was wrong. But how could you convince them that there was a damage connected to getting turned away? And I just two cases on this where I was able to try to get in a jury's head that hadn't had this experience and make them see it. One was a very straightforward place. Somebody turned away from an apartment absolutely clearly because of her race. She was a law professor and was turned away, and the reason that she found out was one of her students lived in the building, and after she applied, the landlord basically said to the student something about, I couldn't let an African American. Well, wait a minute, she's my professor. And the student came and ratted out the landlord to the professor. But the jury kind of got, wow, she was sort of humiliated in front of her student. I mean, she's a professional, accomplished person and sort of humiliated in front of her student. And I asked her on the stand before this jury, I wasn't sure they would see it as damaging because she had found another apartment. I asked her, hey, it sounds like this was a painful experience. It was. Compare it to something else in your life. And she said, well, second most painful thing that I've ever really experienced, that I've really ever had in my life. I said, well, what was the most painful? She said, well, my mom has dealt with mental illness over the course of her life, and that's really painful. But next to that, this is the most significant issue in terms of being painful to deal with, if anything. Well, the jury could kind of say, okay, I got a family that's got mental illness. I know that's hard. If you're putting it up as second to that, I get it. Did another one once. Stepmother. White father and children, divorces, remarries an African American woman. Now, we all know the fairy tales about evil stepmothers. Every stepmother wants her children to really, really love her. and they went to get an apartment, and they got turned away because of the race of the stepmother. So as she's trying to get these kids to embrace her, the kids experience getting turned away from a house that they liked because of their new mother's skin color. The jury got that. I mean, they could clearly understand, wow, this is a challenging time in your life, and of course you love these kids and you want them to adjust and love you too. And now they're getting turned away from a house because of the color of your skin. Yeah, the jury definitely understood that was not cool. But yeah, Lorraine, I'm sure she, in the years since, probably has been in other situations. If I get treated badly, I know it's either because I'm a jerk or the other person's a jerk. Either I was a jerk that day or the other person's a jerk. But when Lorraine is treated badly, she's going to ask herself, hey, is it because of my skin color? And I don't have to ask myself that question, but she's probably asked herself that question a million times since. Anyway, thanks. Good to be with you today.